Mechanics of Reddit. What's the dumbest thing you've seen someone do to their vehicle? My old mechanic had a guy come in with a Ford Probe. He claimed it was low on oil. They take the dipstick out, and the whole stick has oil on it. He checks again with the same result. The guy took the oil cap off and looked down into the hole and said, "See, it is low." He had put 3 to 4 cases of oil in the motor trying to fill the entire block up. The previous mechanic didn't know how to patch an exhaust leak and had tried to weld a Rockstar can around the leak. The leak caused the second oxygen bank to fail, which is why they tried to patch it with the can. Not a week later the bank read a failure again. This probably won't be the worst one in this thread. I used to know a 30-year-old who would put the car air freshener duct taped outside the exhaust, kind of just dangling in front of the opening. His logic was it makes the exhaust smell better for pedestrians. Had a customer once who had their oil light come on and couldn't figure out how to top the oil up. He thought it might have worked like his boat motor, so he poured a jug of oil in his fuel tank. Not a mechanic, but former service writer. Woman comes in for an oil change. Some common minivan, nothing out of the ordinary. Walked by the van while it was up on the rack and noticed one of the tires was nearly bald in the middle. Cords showing. Textbook overinflation. I checked the tire pressure, was well overinflated. Then looked around the vehicle, 2 more tires were in exactly the same state, overinflated and showing damage from it. The 4th was a bit underinflated, no glaringly obvious tread wear. Pointed it out to the customer when she came back, asked if there's any reason 3 tires would be overinflated. Long story short, she was occasionally seeing a low tire light on the dash, no indication of which tire, just low tire. Told her husband, and he just aired up all 4 tires. Happened again, fixed the same way, rinse and repeat. So over time they kept the tire with the leak going, but managed to ruin the other 3. Buy a tire pressure gauge if your car doesn't give you per tire pressure readings. I was working at a performance shop at the time / 2010. Golf GTI comes in for lack of power and throwing check engine codes for underboost and several for fuel trim management conditions. Did the typical process of checking the turbo wastegate operation. Pressure and smoke, tested the charge side of the turbo system for leaks, tested fuel pressures, all checked out. Removed the intake side from the turbo to inspect for rips in the rubber boot, all good. Looked inside the intake boot and this moron bought one of these turbonatorps /I imga.com/mgr2h43 JPG gimmicky things and put it inside the intake. It had turned completely on its side and was restricting / 80% of the airflow. Removed the obstruction and motor operating values returned to normal and power was restored. Did not feel any guilt that this idiot had to pay a few hundred for me to diagnose and remove his awesome DIY performance mod. I wrench on bikes, not cars, and at least once a month we have someone come in that put chain lube or grease on their brake rotors because they were squealing and now wants to know why their brakes aren't grabbing. Completely fill their engine with oil and wonder why it's smoking and then locked up. My mom filled the oil fill with water when the car was overheating. She said that she knew it said oil, but she didn't know where else to put the water. The list is long. Removing PCV hose, assorted vacuum lines, O2 sensor, etc. thinking they are going to get better performance. Cutting a wire under the dash to hook up a stereo. Then bringing the car to me to fix the tail lights. Pouring 3 quarts of oil in, but the dipstick still shows low because they put the oil in the radiator. Putting gasoline in a diesel truck. Again. Did a co-op at a shop back in high school. Guy complains about how his car doesn't sit straight. We pull it in and don't even need to put it on the lift to realize that he has 17-inch rims on one side and 15s on the other. Took me about 45 minutes of explaining to him why cars aren't made like that before he told us that he'd be taking his business elsewhere. On a side note, the side with the 15s were 100% bald, like racing slick bald, and everything in that car was falling to pieces. I have too many stories of shit I found in people's cars there, but this one has to be my favorite. Worked as a car cleaner at a dealership one summer in high school. Guy towed in a relatively new, top of the line Corvette he had bought there some time before I started. He was pissed that it had died on the road and been running like shit before that. Ranting and raving about he spent all this money and it only went X months/years before completely breaking down. One of my work buddies got it up on a lift and started looking it over. He opens the oil drain plug and nothing comes out. He pulls apart the engine and the oil could now be best described as glue. Owner talks to the guy and asks when the last time he changed the oil was. Guy had zero idea what he was talking about. He had no idea that you had to do that. He assumed you just added gas and that's the only thing you needed to do. The engine was a complete loss, which meant the car was a complete loss to him. Edit. Clarification. Not a mechanic. However, I have story for this. Some years ago, here where I live there was a fairly widespread craze of mixing oil. I don't remember the type, but it wasn't at all related with the engine like sunflower oil or something like that with diesel for better fuel consumption. The thought was that this type of oil would burn anyway, and mixed with diesel it would give the same kilometers for less money. Of course it wasn't the brightest of ideas, so I remember that despite being fairly young, I remember strongly advising against this practice. My mother didn't listen to me and proceeded to top her Mitsubishi Pajero turbo grade car for fuel economy, I know, with whatever oil she used. Now, to be fair, the car held up pretty well despite the abuse, which it's because it was a tank. However, it eventually succumbed. If I remember correctly, the fuel pump completely failed and had to be replaced entirely, but I might be forgetting stuff. The funny thing is though that the mechanic, after looking at the engine for about 3 minutes or something like that, asked almost angrily to my mother if she was using the oil. When questioned how he knew that, he said something along the line of, "It's the fourth this week that comes in with this issue." I had a guy bring his motor swapped late 80s F150 in for some transmission work. These came factory with either a 300/6, 351 V8, or 460 V8. He put two 3L carbureted 4-cylinder out of an old Ranger in it. The reasoning behind the swap was that it'd improve fuel mileage at the cost of some speed. The thing could barely move under its own power. If you floored it, it would top out at about 55 miles per hour, wide open, and take a good minute or two to get there. Not a car mechanic, but I knew a guy who used self-tapping screws to fasten a roof rack to his car. Edit. A few people have asked if it worked. Yes, but it leaked. I would not recommend it though, because the roof sheet metal probably doesn't have much load-bearing integrity. Not a mechanic, but a car enthusiast. Saw a couple of cars where owners didn't know what basic maintenance was. Like no oil change, no brake pad change. The oil turned into jelly and you had to scrape it out. The most ridiculous thing were the brakes. My mechanic friend showed me the brakes of an elderly lady's car. The brake discs were gone, like almost completely wiped down to like 5 to 6 millimeters. She said to him, "The car feels weird while I brake." Lady stated that her car said low coolant, so she filled up the coolant. She made it about a mile and the car started running terrible and cut off. Shop rollback picked it up. She filled up the coolant by removing the oil cap and topping the motor off with water. Let me tell you about Diamond Plate Guy and Focus Bro. Diamond Plate Guy had two things he used to modify his truck: a drill and a ton of diamond plate. It was an absolute base model V6 Ram 1500 with the exhaust chopped off, which I thought was bad enough until I opened the hood. He had drilled or glued diamond plate to every flat surface: air filter box, intake manifold, fan shroud, etc. This was 18 months ago. My eyes still haven't recovered, but this isn't the end. He had some crappy wheels that he had painted white himself. I know this because he painted the inside of the wheel where it seats to the hub, which caused them to seize to said hubs. I literally had to buy a bigger hammer to smack them off. Focus Bro Guy had a custom straight pipe, full Sparco race seats, 5-point racing harnesses, lowering springs, and a base model automatic Ford Focus SE. Not a mechanic, but we do almost all of our farm equipment maintenance. Brother called during a hellacious snowstorm telling me, "Hurry, get over here and bring beer." I arrive with Bud Light in hand. Has got 2 lawn chairs under his carport. We get a beer and settled in our chairs out of the snow. We commenced to watching his methed out neighbors that are higher than kites pursue this Mustang. Fear trying to push start it. After about 10 minutes were hysterical. They had been trying for almost 2 hours. It was an automatic transmission. Not a mechanic, but while sitting in the shop waiting for my own car to have work completed, I witnessed a customer and their mechanic talking about the customer's car needing suspension repair. The customer had tried unsuccessfully to do the repair himself. The mechanic asked him why some lug nuts were missing and others were loose. The customer replied how he thought he would be helping the mechanic by loosening the tire for him. The customer had driven 20 minutes to get to the shop with a tire held on by a few loose lug nuts. Dudes spending thousands of dollars modifying their pickups for off-roading, even though they spend 99% of the time on highways, and the furthest off of a road they ever get is a logging road that a stock forester could tackle with no problems. And then complain about extra shooty fuel mileage and having to pay for new 35-inch knobby tires that only last 10k miles because they wear out super quickly if you drive mostly on pavement, and having to replace their front wheel bearings every other year because those larger wheels and tires are a lot heavier than the stock ones, and being super surprised to learn that parts for a 3/4 ton pickup can cost multiple times more than the comparable ones for the small sedan they sold to afford their bro truck. Mechanic here. Lots of stories. One guy has OCD and got a license plate called too clean. Only let one guy in our shop touch his base model Dodge Dakota 2007. Had to double up on gloves and he would watch. Undersprayed his car with chrome spray. I work primarily on equipment. Operator calls us out to his machine saying he had a crack on his boom. Think the first arm on a large excavator. I get out there and the whole boom has broken off and is on the ground. My favorite though had to be the operator who blew a hydraulic hose in a forestry setting. Maybe $200 to change the hose. Decided he wants to walk the machine out to make the hose easier and runs the machine out of oil, blowing up the hydraulic pumps $26,000. 2 travel motors $8,000 each and the auxiliary pump $2,500 each. The machine was down for 2 months for him, deciding to walk an extra 50 meters out of the bush so he didn't have to walk the extra distance. I have tons of stories about lazy operators, but this is probably the laziest lol. Bad snow day. For whatever frig reason we were up, guy pulls up needing a flat repair. He pulled up in a way the car could be just pulled in. Co-worker goes to pull it in and can't stop. Slams into his box. Wasn't going fast enough to damage anything. Car had 0 brakes. Say something to the customer, oh the foot brake? That hasn't worked in years. You have to use the handbrake. We inspect the vehicle and discover it doesn't even have brake calipers in the front, with the hoses clamped off and not an ounce of brake fluid in the master cylinder. And the most surprising part, they didn't want to get the brake repairs done. Edit. Type us holy shoot gold. Thank you kind stranger. Guy was convinced his tires were different sizes because they rotating at different rates. Like, he jacked up each wheel and put the valve stem at the top. Went for a drive and they were not lined up anymore. I had to explain it with chalk and stringing the parking lot. A customer brought their vehicle to the dealership I used to work for an airbag recall. They had bedazzled everything on the interior dash, including the covers for the airbags on the steering wheel and on the passenger side. I'm not sure she understand the fact that airbags have enough power to turn anything into shrapnel. I worked at a Chevy dealer and now work at a Jaguar/Land Rover dealer. I'm not surprised at people's stupidity anymore. More than once I've seen people add oil to the coolant reservoir. I've seen the inside of motor where the customer never changed the oil since it was new and the car had 50xxx miles on it. The dumbest thing I see every day is people come in with broke suspension parts, bald tires and no brakes. They don't buy any of it and just want the oil change and insist we are trying to rip them off. But the same person will come in raising hell over a small safety recall and refuse to leave until it's done because the car's unsafe. Lady had a brand new at the time Subaru and was complaining about horrible gas mileage. People complain about gas mileage all the time and it's usually because of driving habits. I get the car in, and it looked like she hit something in the road and ripped a big hole in the gas tank, and all the fuel she put in poured right out onto the pavement. It was in fact a valid poor fuel economy complaint after all. So many people hammer on battery terminal ends. The types of terminals have changed with modern vehicles, but people still don't understand that batteries are lead and plastic. Don't beat and hammer on that shoot. You will destroy your brand new $100 plus battery. And no, there is no warranty if you smash it with a damn hammer. My dad once poured wiper fluid into where the brake fluid goes. It was my relatively new car, so he wasn't familiar with it and also clearly not paying attention. He tried to tell me it was probably fine, but I made him take it to a mechanic and pay to have it drained and fixed properly. I bet the mechanic had a good laugh that day, and my dad learned a fairly costly lesson about paying attention. Not a mechanic, but I knew a guy who had a Mini Cooper who modified it to ride only an inch or two off the ground, without air-ride suspension, to the extent that he would scrape on road reflectors. Needless to say, he had to replace a lot of his suspension every year or so. Oh, finally a chance to tell my story. I'll keep it short. Guy comes in with a Kia Soul for an oil change. Mentions when he tries to pass people on the highway the engine bogs down. Doesn't want to pay for diagnostic, so I just say, well, see if the visual check included in the oil change brings anything up. This guy put some aftermarket turbo kit in that was just a big fan attached to his throttle body. When he was at watt, it would close the circuit and the fan would blast air into his engine. Only he wired it backwards. The fan would turn on, spin the wrong way, and the engine would starve for air. Update: what is wide open throttle for the STID? Means when the gas pedal is to the floor,